Poor twins give shelter to a millionaire during a storm. The truth about his identity changed their lives forever. The storm arrived with purpose, flattening the city's sound into a steady roar. Street lights flickered. Water climbed the curbs. On a narrow road that never made it into glossy brochures, a black sedan sat pinned beneath a fallen branch, steam curling from its hood. Inside, Richard Harrington pressed a powerless phone, his driver clutching a swollen ankle, both men listening to the rain take over. He stepped into the street, shoes filling with cold water. The neighborhood was a row of tired houses softened by stubborn care, patched porches, sagging gutters, pots of green at doorways someone still tended. Lightning threw the scene into stark relief, and in that brief glare, a modest yellow house stood out, paint peeling in tidy strips, a porch light trembling against the wind. Richard half-carried the driver up the steps and knocked. The door cracked open. Two identical faces appeared, framed by damp curls and serious eyes. Pink dresses. Matching posture. The kind of steadiness that looked older than 7. "Do you need help?" one asked. "We can let you in until the rain passes," the other said, already moving aside. They guided the injured man to a couch mended more than once. The room was small and careful, children's drawings taped straight on the wall, a bookshelf of worn stories, buckets placed under familiar leaks. One twin fetched a towel and a blanket. The other wrapped a bag of frozen peas in a dishcloth and settled it on the driver's ankle with practiced gentleness. "Mom says to help first," the first twin offered, matter of fact. "And worry about thanks after," the second finished. Richard stood awkwardly, rain sliding from his jacket onto the floorboards. He had boardrooms where a glance could quiet a room, cards that opened private elevators, a name that moved markets. None of that could steady the way his chest tightened as he watched two small girls scan a ceiling for drips and adjust their buckets like this was routine. Thunder shook the windows. The lights wavered and went out. The twins didn't startle. A flashlight clicked on, placed exactly in the center of the table. The driver exhaled in relief. Richard looked at his silent phone, then at the girls' mirrored profiles. Something in their faces tugged at a place he had trained himself to ignore. Keys scratched at the lock. The door opened on a gust. A woman stepped in, rain on her hair, fatigue riding her shoulders, alert in the way of those who work around other people's pain. She took in the scene, the strangers, the ankle, the twins upright and unafraid, and set her bag down carefully before closing the door against the wind. Her gaze found Richard. 8 years did their quick math across the distance. "Amara," he said, the name falling out like a habit he thought he'd broken. "Richard," she answered, voice static-free and steady, as if pronouncing a fact in a quiet hallway. A dozen unsent messages lived between them, none of them useful in a storm. She knelt by the driver, checked the swelling, gave clear instructions he followed without argument. The twins hovered, waiting. She stood. Richard started to speak. She raised a hand, not unkind, just a boundary, and nodded toward the couch. "He can stay until the rain passes," she said. "You too." He nodded. The twins returned to their positions, small hands busy, faces tipped toward a ceiling they knew too well. Outside, the storm pressed harder. Inside, for lives held still in a room that felt smaller by the second. They thought this was temporary. A door opened for the weather, a brief pause in separate lives. The rain had other ideas. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Let's get back to the story. Richard Harrington learned early that softness had a cost. His father taught it without raising his voice, a lesson delivered in ledger lines and silences. By 12, Richard could read a balance sheet like a map and understood that winning meant fewer doubts and faster decisions. By 30, he was the man whose handshake signed off entire blocks. By 52, the city skyline reflected his name in mirrored glass. The morning before the storm, he moved through routine with the precision of a metronome. A barber came to his office, not the other way around. A private elevator whisked him past the floor where new hires whispered his name. In the boardroom, a map of the West Side spread across the table, aging buildings, low rents, a community hanging on with both hands. The plan was simple: demolition, new towers, higher margins. A vote. A nod. Done. He called it opportunity. The room agreed. Later, in the quiet of his penthouse, he stood before windows that made the city feel like a diorama. A message from his brother blinked on his phone, an anniversary he never visited, a grave he avoided. He deleted it. The past stayed put if you didn't invite it over. Across town, Amara Wilson tied her hair back in the locker room at the hospital. She had learned that compassion needed structure, timers set for meds, charts updated without gaps, a steady tone for people who woke up confused and afraid. She clocked out with a soft groan and headed to job number 2, a diner where she wore a name tag that still said Amma, because the manager spelled it wrong on the first day and apologized every week without ordering a new one. Evenings were for tips and secondhand jokes, then the late shift at home, bills in careful stacks, numbers penciled in margins, reminders written on sticky notes in a neat hand. The twins slept in the next room, their giggles fading into a low hum of breathing she could hear from the kitchen. Zoe liked order. She lined up crayons by shade and stacked her books from tallest to shortest. She asked questions that made her teachers pause and choose their answers carefully. Zara liked motion. She collected leaves for the texture, tugged at stuck windows, and could tie a knot that lasted a week. Together they moved like a tiny team, mirroring each other without planning it. On the wall above their bed, they had taped up stars cut from foil. They argued quietly about whether to add more or save what was left for their school project. They decided to save them. Saving made sense. It always did. The house shared its age in small ways. A porch step gave a low complaint when crossed too quickly. A socket by the kitchen window sparked if a plug went in at the wrong angle. The roof had learned all the spots where rain insisted and adjusted only so much. Amara kept a bucket under the worst one, not because she liked the sound, but because pretending not to hear it wouldn't make it stop. When the landlord raised the rent again, she pressed her lips together, thanked him for letting her know, and emailed twice about the leak. He responded to the first message. He did not respond to the second. On the day the weather shifted, the air felt heavy by noon. At Harrington Tower, Richard rehearsed a speech about momentum. He wore a tie the color of late tomatoes and nodded through applause. His assistant handed him headlines to scan. The praise read like a promise: visionary, decisive, inevitable. He texted his driver to take the long route around a protest. A handful of signs bobbed at the edge of the property line. He didn't read them. He knew what they said. He didn't need to be told that people loved their homes. He had loved a house once, too, until love made it complicated. At the hospital, an announcement about early release floated down the hall with the scent of bleach. Flood warnings. Staff could go if coverage allowed. Amara finished charting, checked on Mrs. Dominguez's dressings, and left before the first true sheet of rain hit. She stopped for milk. She added apples when she saw they were on sale. Back at the yellow house, the twins dragged a towel snake to the back door where water liked to edge in. They compared math worksheets and traded answers they both already knew. Zoe corrected a 7 to make it straight. Zara leaned back until her chair lifted on 2 legs and grinned when it didn't fall. "Feet down," Amara said without looking. The chair settled. On Richard's desk lay a framed photograph of a ribbon cutting, his smile bright, his hand on a shovel in clean dirt. He didn't keep family photos on his desk. There were none he wanted to explain. He used to carry a dog-eared snapshot of his mother in his wallet, but he stopped after a security checkpoint guard touched it with unwashed hands. He told himself he remembered her fine without a picture. His phone buzzed with a number he recognized but rarely answered. "Tomorrow," he said, and put it face down. Deals required focus. The future stayed obedient if you did not give the past appointments. Clouds lowered. The city changed keys. The sedan slipped off the preferred route onto a street where gutters filled fast. A branch waited for the right gust. In a small kitchen, a single lamp lit a small square of table where a grocery receipt promised a few cents back if returned in a survey. On a bookshelf, a hardcover about building better habits leaned on a paperback romance, the spine cracked in the middle where someone had laughed out loud once and kept reading anyway. If anyone had asked, both Richard and Amara would have said they had made their choices and were living with them. If pressed, they might have added that some choices had been made for them. The same weather report rolled through both lives, announced by different voices on different radios. Neither heard the moment the storm turned from forecast to fact. In the yellow house, 2 small pairs of shoes waited by the door. In the tower, a single pair of polished Oxfords clicked toward an elevator. The city inhaled. Rain began. Rain erased edges. It flattened the city into gray plains and silver lines, cut with the sweep of headlights and the strobe of distant lightning. The driver saw the branch too late. Brakes caught water. Rubber skated. The sedan slid, bumped, and came to rest at an angle that bent dignity out of shape. Pain flared in his ankle. He said one short word through his teeth. Richard checked the signal bars he already knew were gone and slipped the phone back into his inside pocket by habit. The car smelled of hot engine and wet leather. He put a hand on the driver's shoulder. "Can you stand?" "Maybe. Not well." They pushed doors open against the wind. Rain hit with enough force to make both men blink. The street pooled. Water ran hard along the curb toward a drain that pretended it could keep up. They made it to the nearest porch by small, careful moves. The railing shook under the driver's weight. Once under the shallow overhang, Richard knocked with the flat of his knuckles, short taps to conserve heat that still climbed off his soaked suit. Footsteps thudded lightly. The door opened on the chain, closed, opened on the chain again. A voice called, "Zoe, it's strangers." Another answered, "We can still help." The chain slid. The door swung wide. 2 girls stood shoulder to shoulder in identical pink dresses with a dampness along the hem. One had a Band-Aid stuck crooked on a knee that didn't need it. The other held a flashlight in a steady hand aimed at their faces, not their eyes. "You can come in," said the first. "Careful on the rug," said the second. They stepped into a living room shaped like a square shoulder. The driver sank onto a couch that had recovered from other falls. The twins looked at the ankle, then at each other, then moved as if with a plan. "Peas," said one, and vanished toward a kitchen. "Blanket," said the other, pulling one from a chair and shaking it out over the driver's legs, then tucking the corners under like a nurse with small hands. Richard stood near the door, unsure what to do with his height. The room carried the weight of everyday effort, a neat line of shoes, a dish of keys, a calendar with small stars drawn on 3 dates next week. The ceiling held shallow bowls of water where it couldn't help the rain find its way in. "Thank you," the driver told the air, then the girl with the blanket, then the one who returned with peas wrapped in a dish towel. "Thank you." She nodded, serious. "Cold helps swelling. That's what Mom says." "Does your mom know you're letting in strangers?" Richard asked, and immediately heard how it sounded. "She says, if someone's bleeding, you don't make them fill forms," one replied, laying the peas in place. "But we locked the back door first," the other added. She also says that. They both looked at him then, direct but not impolite. Lightning brightened the room for a clean instant. In that white burst he saw it, something about their faces, the set of their mouths. Recognition without context. A tiny tilt in the world. The power went out with a quiet surrender. The room sighed into shadow. The flashlight swept gently and settled upright in the middle of the coffee table, casting a cone that made a circle of clear light and friendly dark beyond it. The twins didn't flinch. The driver relaxed. Rain ran its fingers down the windows. Richard tried his phone again. Nothing. "Do you need to call someone?" one asked, reading the gesture. "Service is out," he said. "We can wait for Mom," the other suggested, as if that solved most things. One of them fetched a metal mixing bowl and set it under a growing drip in the corner. The other adjusted a bucket by the doorway so the water hit the center with a softer sound. They worked without commentary, each anticipating the other, hands moving through the same space without colliding. He watched them, drawn to the efficiency and the care. "What's your name?" the first asked, coming back to stand with her toes just on the edge of the flashlight circle. "Richard." "I'm Zoe," she said. "I'm Zara," said the other, stepping into the light so he could see them both at once. "Thank you, Zoe." "Thank you, Zara," he said formally, because anything else felt like it might crack. "You're welcome," they said together, then looked at each other and smiled like they'd shared the same thought. Thunder rolled as if a truck passed in the sky. Rain pushed harder against the windows and found fresh seams along the roofline. The twins listened to the house the way sailors listen to a ship. When a new sound began, a small tap-tap somewhere above the bookshelf, Zoe turned without looking and retrieved a saucepan from the kitchen. She placed it on the shelf carefully, then slid a book under one side to level it. "Do you do this a lot?" Richard asked, watching how confidently she moved. "Only when it rains like this," she answered. "Which is every time it rains like this," Zara amended. The driver shifted and winced. Zoe adjusted the peas and checked his sock for tightness with the gravity of a person who observes and learns. "It should feel better soon," she told him. "If it doesn't, Mom can look when she gets home." "Your mom is a nurse?" Richard asked. "She helps nurses," Zara said. "And she helps us." The flashlight hummed softly. The house settled into its storm stance. Richard felt water in his shoes and a strange emptiness under his ribs. He could hear himself in rooms like this years ago, his mother's voice in a kitchen, her laugh traveling down a hall. He had stopped thinking of those sounds on purpose because they did not help in meetings. Zoe studied him for one long second, her head a fraction tilted. "You look like you don't like being wet," she observed kindly. "I don't," he said, surprised into honesty. "We don't either," Zara said. "But we like the part after when we get warm." He nodded like that was a thing he had always known. Keys scratched at the front lock. Both girls turned toward the door at the same time, shoulders dropping a fraction. It opened to a rush of damp air and Amara stepped inside, bringing the outside with her. She set the umbrella down with a practiced flick. Her eyes moved once around the room and landed on him. "Hi, Mom," Zoe said, stepping forward without blocking the view. "We helped," Zara added, pointing to the peas like a report. Amara took it all in: driver, ankle, couch, peas, flashlight, buckets, man in a wetsuit, with a clarity that made explanations unnecessary. She knelt, touched the swelling with careful fingers, and named what she found. The driver breathed out and nodded as if being told what it was made it easier to carry. Only when she had done for him what she could did she stand and meet Richard's gaze fully. Years moved between them in a second that stretched. "Amara," he said. It came out less smooth than he expected. "Richard," she answered, neither warm nor cold, just correct. It was the branch, he said, and stopped. The storm, she said, and that was enough. He started to reach for his wallet, the old gesture, and stopped when both twins' faces changed by a degree he could not name but understood. He let his hand fall. "Thank you," he said instead, directing it to the room, to the girls, to the woman standing between past and present like traffic control in a flood. "You can stay until the rain passes," Amara said, wiping a line of water from her temple with the inside of her wrist. "He needs to keep that ankle up. There's tea." She moved toward the kitchen. "Zoe, Zara, towels for the floor." The twins dispersed on command wordlessly. The driver sank deeper into the couch with a look of relief that had nothing to do with money. Richard stood a moment longer, the smallest sensation of being rerouted moving through him like a change in current. The storm pressed the windows and drew away, pressed and drew away. The house breathed with it. Somewhere in the middle of that rhythm, something shifted, slight but irreversible, like a door set on a different hinge. The rain went on. Inside, everyone adjusted. In the kitchen, the kettle clicked on with a soft authority. Amara moved through the narrow space like someone who knew where her hands belonged even in the dark. A candle stub found a small plate. A match flared and settled into a clean flame. The room took on a warm edge that belonged to her and the twins. Richard waited on the threshold with the careful stillness of a guest who understands he has arrived in a life already in motion. Amara set 2 mugs on the counter, opened a tin of tea leaves, and measured by memory. "We can call a car when the lines come back," he offered, not fully sure who he was speaking to. "They won't send one until the road's clear," she said, not looking up. "You'll be here a while." He nodded once. She poured water over the tea and placed a dish towel where steam might stain the counter. The practicalities walked ahead of everything else. "You look tired," he said, and regretted it. "I look like I worked," she answered, still not unkind. She slid a mug toward him and kept a hand on her own for the heat. "The girls said the branch took your car." "It did," he said. "Your daughters did more in 10 minutes than most of my teams do in an hour." "They hear me," she said, with a small lift of one shoulder that held pride and weariness in equal measure. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crowded with 8 years of unspent words. He could feel every one of them and chose none. From the living room came the sound of a game being explained in soft voices. The driver laughed once, a quick bark of surprise that settled back into quiet. Rain kept its steady pressure against the windows. The kettle clicked again, as if to punctuate a thought. "Thank you for letting us in," he said finally. "They would have, even if I hadn't," she replied, glancing toward the twins. "They like to test their lessons against the world." "Those are good lessons," he said. "They're necessary," she said, the word landing with more weight than the others. He took in the details he hadn't allowed himself before, the hem of her scrub pants still damp, a faint crease on her cheek where a mask had sat for hours, a small ink smudge near her thumb from a grocery list or chart note. She looked stronger and more precise than the woman he remembered. She looked exactly like someone who had carried 2 children and too many shifts. A heavy fist hit the front door twice. Both twins froze for a heartbeat and then stood. Amara was already halfway to the living room. "Ms. Wilson," a voice called through the wood, impatient, loud. "About next month." She opened the door a crack and kept her body between the man and the room. Rain pushed colder air into the house. "Not now," she said. "Rates go up on the 1st, the landlord announced as if he were delivering a weather report. No exceptions. And those leaks, weather like this, you know how it is." "It's raining inside," she said evenly. "Fix the roof." He leaned in a fraction. His eyes took in the suit, the couch, the twins' matching dresses. "Company." "A storm," she said, and started to close the door. Names always help roofs get fixed faster, he said, trying on a smile. Richard stepped into view without theatrics. The landlord's expression moved through recognition and calculation quickly. Richard kept his voice flat. "We'll follow up when the city reopens," he said. "Document the repairs. Send invoices. Do the work." The landlord's chin lifted, then dropped. He stepped back, losing weight against the wind. "Weather permitting," he said to the rain more than to them, and left the porch. Amara closed the door with a care that avoided rattling the frame. The twins exhaled, almost audibly. She turned, eyes moving over the room again before landing on Richard. "I didn't ask for that," she said. There was no heat in it, just a boundary drawn with a straight edge. "I know," he said. He needed to hear it. "He needed to fix the roof last year," she said. "He didn't need your name." He accepted the correction with a small nod. "Noted." She watched him for a beat longer, and then the line of her shoulders softened by a degree. "Thank you," she added, without emphasis. "Of course," he said, and meant both what he had done and what he would not do again without being asked. In the living room, the twins had set up a board with colored paper money and small metal tokens. They waved them closer without fuss. Amara sat cross-legged on the rug. Richard took the far end of the coffee table and chose a token without looking. The driver balanced his mug carefully on a stack of magazines and watched them with interest. The game did not follow the rules Richard remembered. Rent could be forgiven if someone is having a hard week. Properties could be shared if it helps people. The bank gave out an extra small bill if someone remembers to say please. He tried not to smile and failed. Amara noticed and did not hide her own. They played through a blackout storm in a room that looked more generous in candlelight than it did in sun. Time stretched and softened. At one point, Zoe frowned seriously and handed him a paper bill because you helped with the landlord. He took it and slid it back across the table. "You helped first," he said. She accepted the logic without argument. When the hour turned without announcement, Amara gathered the twins with a tap on the clock face. Teeth were brushed by flashlight. 2 hugs were given, one to the driver, one to the man in the wetsuit, equal in pressure. Their bedroom door closed with a click that sounded like trust put on hold, not surrendered. Amara returned to the kitchen. Richard followed at a respectful distance. The house seemed to listen with them to the rain, to consider the question neither had asked out loud: how long this would last, and what would be left on the other side of it. She rinsed the mugs, set them upside down on a towel, and turned to face him fully for the first time since the door. He matched the stance, hands at his sides. "We're not talking about before," she said, making it a condition, not an invitation. "No," he agreed. "You can stay until the rain passes," she repeated, as if both of them needed to hear it again. "I'll help where I can," he said, and left the offer small and practical. She considered him the way she considered a new task on an overfull list. "Good," she said. "There's a pot in the hallway catching a drip that keeps wandering." He found it and moved it 2 inches to the left. It caught the water more cleanly. In the quiet that followed, the house kept listening to the storm. So did they. Rain found new seams. In the hallway, the drip that had been steady now quickened. In the kitchen, a soft patter began in a spot that had behaved all winter. The house answered with small adjustments. Bowls moved, towels folded into thicker layers, a broom laid across a door to keep it from rattling in its frame. The driver dozed, ankle elevated, breath leveling into the kind that only comes when pain loosens its grip. The twins negotiated one more round of their game and argued in whispers over whether a player who helped move a bucket should be exempt from paying rent for a turn. Amara listened from the kitchen doorway and let them solve it without her. Richard's phone sprang to life for a few seconds, jittering with vibrations he could feel more than hear. He stepped into the narrow hallway for signal and saw headlines multiply faster than his thumb could catch them. Words flashed: inquiry, accounts, vote. He scrolled without meaning to, eyes dragging over lines that grew sharper by the second. A colleague's name appeared beside a quote that left out everything that mattered. He stood very still, as if not moving could keep anything from falling. The signal dropped again. The phone went dark. He slid it back into his pocket and faced the wall for a count of 5 before he returned to the light. Amara watched him come back in with the bland expression of someone who has learned to wait for the facts to arrive before reacting. She had spent enough nights on her feet to know when a person was holding their breath. "Bad?" she asked. "Loud," he said. She nodded once, a small acknowledgement that noise and threat sometimes arrived dressed as the same thing. The twins had pulled him back to the table with a directness that left little room for refusal. He sat and picked up his token, grounding his fingers around its cool edge. Zoe handed him an extra bill unceremoniously. "You missed a turn," she said, matter of fact. "That seems generous," he answered, placing it in his pile without protest. "It's the rule," Zara said. "We wrote it down so we remember." Amara folded a towel along its worn crease and moved to the hallway leak that had found speed. Richard stood immediately and took the towel from her, sliding the bowl out with careful hands and replacing it with a wider pan. The water hit the new surface with a softer sound. He arranged the towel to catch what the pan missed, then adjusted the angle by a finger's breadth until the drip found its center. She watched the series of choices with a blank face that had a small smile hiding somewhere behind it. "Thank you," she said. "Learning," he replied. The game eased the room into an order the storm couldn't reach. The twins made space for small mercies. If someone forgot to roll, they got a second chance. If someone had to give up a property, they could keep a corner of it if they promised to plant a tree there. The banks sometimes paid out kindness because the twins had decided that banks should try that. When the girls began to yawn in a sequence, Amara gathered them toward the hallway with a touch to each shoulder. Teeth were brushed by candlelight once more. Small feet moved down the creaking boards. At the doorway, both turned back in a reflex that had not been taught. They hugged Richard briefly, arms around his waist exactly as far as their reach would allow, and then vanished into their room like a practiced magic trick. He stood a moment, looking at the doorway after they were gone, as if the hug had unsettled something in the room. In the kitchen, Amara was rinsing cups in water that came out slow when the pipes were cold. The candlelight found the edge of fatigue around her eyes. Richard joined her with the set of a man who did not yet trust his voice. "I saw the headlines," she said, not a question. He nodded. "A colleague found a camera before I found the truth," he said. Her brow lifted. "Will you be all right?" He almost said yes, the old syllable that solved meetings. He almost said it out of habit. Instead, he took a breath and let some of it out unspent. "I don't know," he said, and the admission altered his face in a small way that made him look less bulletproof and more human. She leaned against the counter and looked at him without hurrying to fill the silence. "Do you have people you trust?" she asked. He considered and pictured a list of first names aligned under titles. He pictured a brother's text he had dismissed. He pictured an assistant who worked as if his days were her only job. He lowered his eyes to his hands and realized they had curled into loose fists on the edge of the counter. "Some," he said. "Maybe not the right ones." The roof answered for them with a sound like a hand tapping on a table to get attention. Amara moved, and he moved with her, without coordinating it or stepping on her toes. Between them, they made a smooth shape of the next few minutes. Pan replaced, towel folded, a chair nudged closer to catch spray. His phone stuttered alive again. This time, his CFO's name lit the screen. He met Amara's eyes briefly in a glance that asked for permission to bring outside noise into the room. She nodded, then stepped away to give him a pocket of privacy. He answered. The voice at the other end came fast, had edges. They're calling an emergency session in the morning. There's talk of interim leadership. We need you here at first light. Richard listened, asked 3 questions, said 4 words that sounded like acceptance. He ended the call with a tone that did not match either defeat or defiance. He stood a moment longer, and then he put the phone on the table face down and came back to the sink where Amara was drying her hands. Morning will arrive either way, she said. I used to like mornings, he said. You still might, she replied. He reached for a towel and took the next plate without asking. They worked side by side like a team that hadn't practiced but shared the same playbook. The house groaned once when a gust found the right angle. The candle flame leaned and straightened. When they finished, he looked toward the living room where the driver had folded his long body into a shape the couch could hold. He'll be okay, he asked. He'll need a scan to be sure, she said. But it looks like a sprain. Rest, ice, compression, elevation. Rice, he said, dredging the acronym up from someplace far back. Still works, she answered. For a few minutes, the storm thinned. The spaces between lightning widened. The rain stepped down from a heavy percussion to a steadier rhythm. In that pause, the house let out small noises, as if adjusting its joints. Amara leaned her hip against the counter and studied him openly. You've become the man you planned to be, she said. Does it feel like what you expected? He stared at the line where the wall met the ceiling. Some days I wake in a quiet room and can hear the air turn on, he said. On those days it feels like I aimed well and hit the wrong target. She held his gaze and gave the smallest nod. Do you want to be right or do you want to be better? She asked, not accusing, simply curious. He had answers ready for 100 kinds of questions. Not for this one. He glanced at the hallway where 2 small sleepers breathed under foil stars, then back at the woman whose living room he had flooded with his presence and whose kitchen he had been allowed to stand inside. Better, he said quietly, as if naming it out loud might erase the option to pretend otherwise. Her mouth softened. That costs something, she said. I can afford some things, he replied, half a smile tumbling out and stopping before it got careless. The power flickered, tried to return, failed, returned halfway, then gave up. A distant siren sketched a line through the rain and faded. Somewhere down the block, a neighbor shouted a name and got an answer back that sounded like relief. Amara checked the twins once more and returned with their bedroom door pulled nearly closed. Richard took the chair by the window and watched water travel down glass in steady lines. Midnight folded into later. He thought of his father then, not as a statue on a pedestal, but as a man who would have considered this living room a detour and this conversation a lapse. He let the thought exist without obeying it. On the table, the board game lay mid-play, small houses arranged in ways that had never existed on any version he had known. A single note lay face down near the bank, a reminder written in neat 7-year-old print. He turned it gently and read, "Be kind first. Be strong next." He set it back exactly where he'd found it and leaned his head against the chair. The storm, satisfied for the moment, moved from pounding to insisting. The house, satisfied for the moment, breathed. He closed his eyes, just long enough to see a face from years ago and 2 faces from tonight overlap and settle into something that made sense only because it was happening. The house warned them before it failed. A quick patter above the twins' room, a seam darkening like a bruise, then a sudden sag as soaked plaster swallowed any promise it had left. Amara was halfway down the hall when the first piece let go with a heavy wet thud. "Ouch," she said, voice steady and low. The twins were already moving. Zoe grabbed the stuffed rabbit from the pillow. Zara scooped up the flashlight from the floor. Richard covered the distance in 3 quick strides and lifted both girls, one arm for each, just as a slab of ceiling gave way and collapsed across the bed, sending a spray of soggy insulation into the air like torn snow. Debris settled. The room went quiet in the way rooms do after a break. Richard stood in the hallway with the twins tucked against him, their small hearts beating hard into the fabric of his ruined shirt. Amara reached up and brushed plaster dust from Zoe's hair, then from Zara's cheek, her fingers gentle and sure. No one spoke for a breath too long, as if any sound might jar the house into another fall. "Bathroom," Amara said, leading them away. In the mirror's candlelit reflection, the twins looked back at themselves with wide, assessing eyes. Amara dampened a washcloth and used it to clear pale dust from their faces, the movements automatic and tender. "It's okay to be scared," she said, meeting their eyes in the glass. "We're not," Zara answered, chin lifting. "We are a little," Zoe admitted, pressing the rabbit to her chest. "Both can be true," Amara said, and that seemed to satisfy something in them. In the living room, the driver had roused to the sound and was already pushing himself upright. "Everyone all right?" he asked, voice rough with sleep and concern. "We're okay," Amara said. "The bedroom isn't." Richard set the twins down. They held to his sleeves for a second longer than necessary, then stepped back at the same moment, as if they had agreed without speaking. He looked down at the thin layer of plaster dust on his arms, surprised by the unremarkable sight of it. "Hotel," Amara said, scanning the room for what they'd need. "Just for the night." The driver attempted to rise. Richard was at his side instantly, easing him back with a hand on his shoulder. "You'll make it worse," he said. "Let me arrange something." Amara nodded, distracted by mental checklists. "2 changes of clothes for them," she murmured. "Toothbrushes. Shoes. The homework folder." "Rabbits," Zara added, though there was only one. "Rabbit," Zoe corrected softly, handing it to her sister without being asked. They moved through the practical steps of leaving a house that could not hold them for the night. The twins pulled on rain boots and their lightest coats. Amara stuffed clothes into a tote bag and slid the folder of school papers in on top. Richard used what was left of his phone's stubborn signal to secure a room not too far away. 2 beds, hot water, a door that closed without rattling. Thomas's number blinked on his screen between attempts. He sent a short message with the hotel's name and nothing more, the kind of text that said it all to someone who knew how to read him. They stepped back onto the porch together. The rain had eased by a degree. Water still ran along the curb in a determined stream. The house stood behind them, dignified despite the new wound. Amara turned the key in the lock with an old habit's care and tested the handle once, even though she knew it would hold. Thomas arrived in his SUV minutes later, windshield wipers sketching quick arcs. He took in the scene in a glance, the girls, the tote bag, the look on his brother's face, and moved without question to help the driver to the car. "You all right?" he asked low, already adjusting seats and offering an arm. "I've been better," the driver said, attempting a wry smile that almost made it. They packed into the warmth of the vehicle, twins in the back with the rabbit, Amara and Richard side by side in the middle. The driver stretched carefully into the front passenger seat. The heater made the air smell faintly of rubber and rain. At the hotel, the lobby offered the bright, hushed order of spaces designed to make bad nights feel manageable. The clerk glanced at their damp clothes, clocked plaster dust with a quick eye, and slid room keys across the counter without apology. In the elevator, Zara studied the mirrored walls until her own reflection stopped looking like a stranger. The room had 2 queen beds, a desk, and the particular quiet that comes from thick carpets and double-paned glass. The twins ran their hands along the bedspreads, testing the bounce, then climbed onto the closest mattress with bare, dusty knees and sank on purpose. Their laughter lifted the air by a notch. Amara went to the bathroom and turned on the shower until steam began to rise. She checked the water with her wrist, adjusted, and called the girls in one at a time. Plaster washed down the drain in soft spirals. The twins emerged pink-cheeked and damp-haired, wearing oversized hotel towels like capes. Richard turned away out of a courtesy that felt natural and folded their coats over the back of a chair. When his turn came, he stood under the water longer than he meant to, not for luxury but to scrub out the smell of wet plaster and something older. He watched dust run off his wrists in pale ribbons and thought of the ceiling, the bed, the narrow hallway with its clean line of drips, things that held until they couldn't. He emerged to a room that had reshaped itself into a small campsite. The twins had taken possession of one bed with a neat line of hotel pillows arranged like a wall at the foot. Amara sat on the edge, combing out knots gently as the girls leaned forward so the pull wouldn't catch their scalps. Thomas had stepped out to find ice for the driver's ankle and returned with 2 small milks added to his tray, which he handed off like contraband. "You're a saint," Amara said, and he shrugged it away with a grin. Richard stood by the window. The city looked softer beneath the sheen of rain. Far across town, a tower with his name somewhere inside it still had lights on. In this room, the lamp cast a smaller circle of warmth that felt larger. He pulled the desk chair closer and sat, keeping his height from taking up more space than it needed. The twins looked at him over the tops of their towels, then at each other, then back. "Will we go home tomorrow?" Zoe asked, not anxious, only looking for the shape of the next day. "We'll see what the roof says," Amara answered. "We'll figure it out." "We can stay at Auntie Nia's," Zara suggested, remembering a couch that pulled out and a jar of jelly beans on a high shelf. "That's our backup," Amara said. "For tonight, this is good." The driver held the ice to his ankle and watched a sitcom with the volume almost off, laughing under his breath at jokes written to be easy. Thomas texted someone and then set his phone face down, an offer of attention not always accepted but always noticed. The twins asked for a story. Amara's voice fell into its bedtime cadence, familiar and sure. She chose one about 2 travelers who learned to share a road. The girls listened with their eyes half closed, interrupted only to correct a detail she had changed on purpose. Richard listened too, and found himself completing the final line in his head a beat before she said it. When the story ended, Zoe propped herself on an elbow. "Will you be there for the play?" she asked, voice heavy with sleep. "I'm a tree." "Second row," Zara added. "She shades the sun." "That's me." Richard swallowed and nodded once. "Yes." "Even if it's a work day?" Zoe pressed. "Even if a boardroom lit up and a dozen names said his own for reasons he didn't like?" "Yes," he said again, and meant it, so simply that there was nothing left to negotiate. They fell asleep in seconds, as children do after thunderstorms and hot water. Amara stayed on the edge of the bed a moment longer, smoothing down damp curls and adjusting the blanket to cover a foot that always kicked free. Richard took the other bed's edge without lying back, a man in a suit jacket that had dried into an odd shape. Amara glanced at him and nodded toward the chair. "It's softer than it looks," she said, too tired to argue for pride or propriety. Thomas stretched out on the room's small sofa with the kind of adaptability that belongs to younger brothers and teachers. The driver surrendered to the dull ache in his ankle and tilted his head back, eyes closing. Much later, when the room had settled into the low white noise of the ventilation and the huff of the hallway ice machine, Zara shifted and discovered a stripe of darkness too wide for sleep. She slid off the bed and padded to the other, where Richard still sat, shoes off, hands slack on his knees. She put her small hand on his sleeve. "Bad dream," she murmured. He moved aside without lifting her, making space as if he had always known how. She climbed up and curled into a small comma against his side. He did not breathe for a second, then he did, slow, and placed his hand lightly on the blanket where her shoulder rose and fell. Across the room, Amara watched in the reflection of the window and did not speak. She lay back and closed her eyes. In the morning, consequences would arrive with dry roads and headlines. Repairs would have to be arranged, discussions endured, choices made with clearer air. But for the span of one night, in a hotel room that smelled faintly of detergent and wet wool, 4 people found a shape that fit. The storm outside downgraded itself to steady rain. The storm inside quieted to a soft, persistent thought. Some promises are made in whispers and held louder by actions than words. Morning arrived with clean edges. The hotel curtains held most of the light at bay, but even the quietest rooms can't keep day from finding the spaces under doors. The twins woke first, whispering because whispering felt right in a place with carpets this thick. Amara checked her phone and found a message from the landlord, a photograph of the bedroom ceiling and a line about act of God that avoided saying anything useful. Richard's phone held different messages. His assistant had sent an itinerary that began at dawn, a string of times lined up like dominoes: emergency session, council, a call with press. Thomas texted a question and got a brief answer that didn't ask for help but didn't banish it either. They returned to the yellow house to assess what the rain had done. The air inside smelled of damp wood and gypsum, clean in its own way. The bedroom held its wound openly. Daylight made the break plain, plaster laid open over the bed like a dropped cake. Amara stood with her hands on her hips and recalibrated plans in silence. Zara pointed to the hole and breathed out the word "Whoa, Reverend." Zoe took notes on a page from a homework folder, drawing a small rectangle for the ceiling and shading in the missing piece. Richard and Thomas fetched tarps and tools from a hardware store that had opened early. The owner took one look at their suits and set out the right nails without commentary. Back at the house, they climbed to the roof. The shingles fought under their hands. The wind argued with them on principle. They worked anyway. Amara handed up what they needed and held the ladder steady, her instructions clear and brief. The quick fix wasn't pretty, but it promised to hold until insurance and estimates could be forced into motion. When they came down, Amara gave a tight nod to the blue patch on the roof and turned to the inside problem. Neighbors had appeared, one with a wet vac, one with an extra fan, another with coffee in a thermos and 2 rolls of painter's tape because tapes always disappear when needed. The twins floated between tasks, given jobs that made sense for their size, collecting smaller pieces of plaster, sorting screws, counting towels into a basket. Someone taped plastic across the doorway to keep dust from traveling further than necessary. By late morning, the house had settled into a holding pattern. The twins were sent with a neighbor for pancakes and cartoons. The driver, ankle-bandaged and crutched, insisted he would be fine getting himself to urgent care for a scan. Thomas promised to return for him after. That left the living room to Amara and Richard. She wiped a patch of table clean with slow strokes that pressed rag to wood. He set a mug of coffee down and kept his hands on either side of it to look less like he might leave the moment it cooled. The air between them held fewer old silences than the night before. New questions had unnamed shapes. "Your company wants the west side," she said without preface, as if they had been mid-conversation and had only stepped away for a tarp. "They want margins," he said. "The west side is how they see getting them." "How do you see it?" Her eyes didn't leave his. He looked past her toward the yard, where a tricycle lay on its side in the mud and a pair of bright rain boots stood like punctuation by the steps. He thought of maps laid across a boardroom table, the neighborhood reduced to color blocks and legend entries. He thought of last night's board game with rules rewritten and new outcomes awarded. "I see people who can't move as fast as numbers do," he said, choosing each word as if he might swallow it wrong. She nodded once. "Then you already know the answer to the question you won't ask." He considered deflecting and found the habit hard to reach for. "What would you do if it were you?" he asked instead. Build where no one sleeps, invest where people already live, and stop calling it help when it costs them their home, she said simply. It's not complicated unless you make it that way. He felt the words land in a place unaccustomed to impact. He took in the clean line of her jaw, the calm in her voice, and the thin vein of steel that ran through each sentence. He had admired that once, and then he had walked away because steel got in the way of speed. The front door opened without a knock, the way family does. Thomas stepped in, hair untidy from the roof, a manila envelope under his arm. He glanced between them and lifted the envelope like proof that he had come on purpose. "You should see this," he said to Richard, then looked to Amara as if asking permission to take up space in her house with the past. She tilted her head toward the table. "If it helps, it belongs," she said. Thomas slid photos onto the wood. They were from another decade, two young men standing awkwardly beside a stoic older one in a suit that fit like armor. In the next, the older man shook hands with a developer whose grin looked like a cut. Clipped articles followed, quiet purchases, a string of shell companies, a pattern of evictions that never found the front page because they happened on different blocks at different times. He used companies that never touched his name, Thomas said. But the money threaded back. Windfalls arrived whenever the residents gave up or got pushed. It started long before the firm was big enough to hide anything in plain sight. Richard traced one line with his eyes, the way a child learns a new letter. He didn't touch the paper. The face of the older man in the photo stared back at him, untroubled by consequences he had expected others to carry. He closed his eyes for a second, enough to dim the glare of recognition. "It's not your signature," Thomas said, a brother's mercy offered quickly. "But it built your runway." Amara looked from one to the other and saw the shift happen in real time. She'd heard enough stories told in emergency rooms to know that the wound is not always where the blood shows first. "The board will use this," Richard said finally, voice low. "If they haven't already." "They will," Thomas agreed. "Or you will first." The twins returned in a burst of syrup and chatter, cheeks pink from warmth and attention. The papers slid back into the envelope by unspoken agreement. Even the house seemed to exhale at their noise. Zoe held up a folded napkin with a drawing on it, two stick trees, a square house, for figures holding hands under a slant of rain that turned into lines of sun at the edge of the paper. "This is us leaving the house and coming back when it's fixed," she said. "We'll add the roof later." Zara produced two stickers from a pocket and handed one to her mother and one to Richard, solemn as a ceremony. Amara laughed and placed hers on the back of her phone. Richard looked at his, then at the girls, then stuck it to the inside of his wallet where no one would see it and where it would touch his hand every time he reached for a card. "Why is your house so tall?" Zara asked, remembering the drive past glass and steel. "So people can look out far," he said. "Do they look down too?" Zoe asked. "Not enough," he answered, and the truth inside it surprised him. Afternoon stretched. The driver returned with a brace and instructions. Insurance held as long as someone stayed on hold. A contractor promised to come after the next job, which meant evening if luck bent their way. The landlord sent another message about timelines that avoided specifics. Neighbors peeled away, called back to their own repairs and meals. When quiet returned, it settled differently. The living room looked like a place that had been defended all day by small acts. Richard stood by the window with his jacket back on, tie knotted, the picture of a man heading toward a fight he could not script. Thomas adjusted his cuffs and gathered the envelope again, ready to stand beside him without pretending to understand the whole play. Amara walked them to the door. The sky had cleared just enough to show a pale band of blue above wet trees. The street smelled fresh in the way only washed cities do. "Will you be at the meeting?" she asked, even though she knew the answer. "Yes," he said. "And after?" she asked. He held her gaze and did not reach for the easy lie. After, he said, leaving it open on purpose, as if the word could hold a place for whatever choice the next hours demanded. The twins appeared and wrapped their arms around his waist like they were fastening a belt. "Don't forget the play," Zoe murmured, as if that had been the go-to promise since the invention of theaters. "I won't," he said, and it felt like a vow signed in a stronger ink. They watched him and Thomas walk to the car. Richard paused at the curb and looked back at the house. Patched roof, plastic-taped doorway, a light left on in the kitchen to make the rooms feel less temporary. He lifted a hand. Amara returned it. The car pulled away, its tires spitting small fans of water. The past had knocked twice. The next door waiting to open had a different kind of storm behind it. The boardroom was a theater without applause. Chairs lined up in neat ranks, the screen already alive with slides that used color to make pressure look orderly. Outside, glass reflected a city rinsed clean. Inside, the air ran cool and dry over the backs of men and women who knew where they wanted the vote to land. Richard sat at the head of the table and felt the weight that had once thrilled him settle differently. The general counsel spoke first, a careful cadence wrapped around phrases that softened sharp things: interim leadership, continuity, protecting value. The CFO laid out numbers like stones across a river, each one a place to plant a foot if the current caught. A director with a smile that never reached his eyes described concerns and market confidence, all nouns that did the particular work of removing the person from the problem. They had papers to pass. He did not pick them up. Thomas stood in the back, a quiet piece of ballast. The envelope rested against his ribs. He watched faces he didn't know learn to be polite as they edged a man toward the door. A motion was made. Voices followed it. Hands rose. Enough of them to matter. Richard did not argue point by point. He asked 3 questions that sounded like he was checking the weather. Who benefits? Who is left holding what isn't claimed? If I step back, what stays the same? The answers tried to move like water around rock. He listened until he had heard enough to recognize the shape of the plan even without its edges. His name lay across the documents like a dare. He had spent years turning it into a lever. Today, it felt like a weight someone else had learned to use. The meeting adjourned into smaller conversations, the kind that hide in doorways and start with the sentence, "You know how it is." He stepped past them, through the hush of the executive hall, into his office. The room received him without sympathy. He stood before the windows that turned the city into a picture and watched people cross streets in small purposeful lines. His phone filled with messages that pulsed and stacked. A lawyer wanted to discuss exposure. A reporter asked for comment. A donor wanted to know where this leaves us. He turned the volume down and set the device in the center of the desk, as if placing it there could keep it from deciding anything for him. On the credenza sat a slim file he had always meant to open when he had more time, a memo on displacement in neighborhoods marked for revitalization. He flipped it open and read a paragraph that mentioned a yellow house on a block he had walked last night with plaster in his hair. He closed the file and pressed both palms flat against the wood. Thomas stepped in without knocking. He didn't sit. He set the envelope down and, after a second, slid it across the desk. "If you want to use it," he said quietly. Richard kept his hands where they were. "If I use it, it breaks something that never learned to bend. If you don't, they use it in a way that keeps everything straight in the wrong direction," Thomas answered. Richard looked up. They held each other's gaze the way brothers do when the ground shifts under both of them at once. The choice did not reduce itself under scrutiny. It grew clearer instead. He picked up the envelope and weighed it like a tool he hadn't been trained to use. He set it down again. Outside the glass, a bus paused, doors opened, people got on, and the bus continued. The unremarkable rhythm of a city carrying itself forward made the room feel overdesigned. He thought of the twins asleep on the hotel bed, blanket kicked away and reclaimed, trust visible in the messy way children abandon their defenses. He thought of the board game with rules adjusted by two small lawmakers who believed fairness could be written in by hand. He thought of Amara's voice in the kitchen saying, "It's not complicated unless you make it that way." He reached for his phone and found the calendar entry he had ignored when the assistant first added it. Third grade play, Thursday, 2 p.m. He moved it to the top of the day and pinned it there. The general counsel returned, soft tread, careful face. "There's still room to negotiate terms," she said. "You could step back for a period. Keep a title. Let the heat move past you." He pictured himself on a dais with a decorative roll, nodding while the machine moved without him. He pictured a girl in a cardboard tree costume looking for a face in the second row and not finding it. He measured the distance between those two images and found he couldn't pretend the smaller one mattered less. He stood. "Schedule a full session," he said. "No side doors. Everyone in the room." She hesitated. That could become public. "Let it," he said, and the words felt like tearing tape off a seam that never sealed right in the first place. He walked the long hall back toward the boardroom with Thomas beside him. The envelope remained under his arm, heavier now that he had decided to carry it into light. Down on the street, traffic leaned into the afternoon. In the yellow house, fans whirred and plastic fluttered. Amara answered a call from the contractor. "We can start tomorrow," the voice said, optimistic the way tradespeople learn to be. She said yes, and yes again when he warned the timeline might change. Back in the tower, faces gathered. The room took on a showday quiet. Richard looked at the array of names, the titles on brass, the people who had watched his rise in real time and were prepared to watch a fall if it kept the numbers square. He began with what they expected, acknowledgement of the storm they were in, the need to protect what could be saved. Then he kept going past the place where most speeches stop. He talked about the neighborhoods reduced to maps and the houses reduced to boxes, the families made to move because a model said the return improved when the people were new. He reached for the envelope and laid its contents down, not like a weapon, but like a mirror. A few faces changed. Some didn't. One director stared at a point just left of the documents as if focus could alter facts. The cost of the moment was visible, in the drop of a share price on a screen, in the stiffening of someone who saw their bonus shrink, in the certainty that doors would close on him that had once opened. He did not mention the play. He did not need to. He ended with a line that surprised him with its steadiness. "If this name cannot stand for better, then it can stand for less." A pause held the room. Then, motion. Voices layered. The general counsel began advising. The CFO ran quick math. A director asked for a recess. The old structure tried to reassert itself, to funnel this into a familiar path. He stepped back from the head of the table and left the envelope where anyone could reach it. In the corridor, he let out a breath he couldn't remember holding since the night before. He took out his phone, checked the time, and saw that the day had been split cleanly in two, what had been expected, and what would be chosen next. The elevator chimed. He pressed the button for the lobby. Outside, the light had shifted from gray to something warmer that made wet streets shine. He headed toward the kind of appointment that never fits on a calendar. The elementary school auditorium smelled of tempera paint and old wood. Paper scenery lined the back of the stage. Cardboard trees, a blue river taped in a wavering line, a paper sun with a smile. Parents filled folding chairs, angling their phones, whispering names that sounded like prayers and reminders at once. Richard stood in the aisle until he found them. Amara had chosen seats near the middle, not too close, not too far. The twins, in green shirts and leaf crowns, bounced a little in the measured way of children trying to be good. When they saw him, something in their posture changed. Shoulders loosening a fraction, chins lifted like they'd found the person they'd been scanning for. He sat beside them, heart running a beat faster than the room's rustle. "You're here," Zoe said, obvious and relieved. "I told you," he answered. The play began. Lines were recited with care. A mouse forgot a word and found it again in the next sentence. When it was time for the forest to appear, the twins stepped forward and took their places, arms wide in gentle arcs to shade the stage sun. Zara looked sidelong toward the second row, found his face, and steadied. Zoe lifted her hands in a half-circle that made the paper leaves seem to move. The room filled with the kind of applause reserved for small triumphs that feel larger than they look. After, in a hallway packed with coats and laughter, gym mats leaning like quiet witnesses along the wall, the twins presented him with a program marked in pencil, trees circled, his name written crookedly in the margin. Amara stood back, watching the exchange with eyes that had lost their urgency and gained something weightier. "I have to go back," he said to her simply. "There's a meeting I asked for." She measured him for truth and found enough. "What do you need?" she asked. He hesitated. "To stop hiding behind the parts of my life that look good in pictures," he said. "To say aloud what I should have said sooner. To ask you and the girls to stand with me while I do it." Her breath left in a slow exhale. Past and present unspooled between them, threads visible, knotting in new places. "This is not a stage for children," she said, not unkind, not as refusal but as care. "I know," he said. "It's a room where people make decisions about the places they'll grow up. I won't ask them to speak. I'm asking if they can be seen." Amara looked at the twins. "Would you like to see where he works?" she asked, giving them a choice first. Zara's eyes widened. Zoe's narrowed in concentration, weighing something she didn't know how to name. Both nodded in the same heartbeat. The drive back to the tower felt shorter. The city showed its clean side after the storm, windows shining, sidewalks bright. In the elevator, reflected faces looked back. Man in a suit that didn't feel like armor, woman in a jacket that had known rain, two small girls with paper crowns now slightly bent. Outside the boardroom, voices gathered in clumps. The general counsel approached with a last-second strategy that had the edges of caution. Richard listened and shook his head once. "Everyone stays," he said. "No closed session." They entered. Conversations fell into a hush that had the texture of surprise. Some faces registered calculation, others curiosity. A few softened when they saw the children. Richard didn't stand at the head of the table. He moved to the side, a half step away from the center. Thomas joined the back wall, hands folded, present like a quiet affirmation. Amara stood with the twins near the glass, sunlight laying a stripe across their shoes. "We can pick up where we left off," the chair began, voice smooth. "We won't," Richard said, and the room turned toward him fully. "Not yet." He spoke without notes. The words had lived in him long enough to know their own way out. He acknowledged the questions that had gathered since the night before, named the concerns without varnish, and refused the urge to dress anything in language that let it pass unnoticed. "My father taught me that speed and certainty win," he said. "He built practices that protected the return and ignored the people who made that return possible. I learned those lessons well. Too well." A murmur moved across the table, a wind through tall grass. He opened the envelope, slid its contents out smoothly, and didn't look away as he set them down. "This is part of our inheritance," he continued. Through companies meant to keep his name clear, he profited when people were pushed from their homes. We built on that cleared ground. We told ourselves the city was cleaner for it. We told ourselves we were building opportunity. We did not stand still long enough to hear who we were stepping over. The general counsel took a breath to interject. He held up a hand, not to silence, but to finish the one thought he'd come to say. "I can't ask a team to change if the name on the door won't," he said. "So I'll say this without bargaining or spin. I'm stepping down as CEO today. I'll stay on only long enough to do 3 things I should have done years ago: halt any project that displaces residents without a real path back, create an independent fund to repair and preserve homes we've endangered, and open our books on the developments at the heart of these allegations. When I leave, these commitments leave with me as obligations, not favors." Faces shifted. Some relief. Some alarm. One director leaned toward another, whispering behind a hand. A third stared at the papers as if seeing his own reflection in them for the first time. He looked to the glass wall where Amara stood with the twins, both girls holding their crowns steady with one hand as if they understood the symbolism without the word. He drew a breath that seemed to come from deeper than his lungs. "I also owe you a truth that won't fit in a ledger," he said, turning back to the room but speaking toward the glass. "Years ago, I walked away from someone who deserved better. She built a life without me. By a series of mercies I didn't earn, a storm put me on her porch 2 nights ago. I met 2 girls who knew more about courage than most people I've met in rooms like this." He didn't look for permission from anyone. He turned to the twins. "Zoe. Zara," he said, his voice softer but steady. "You don't need my name to be whole. But I would be honored if you let me say publicly what I should have been present to say from the beginning. I am your father. I didn't know. Now I do. And I will show up." A silence like the inside of a bell followed, shocked and clean. No cameras had been invited, but word traveled without lenses. The room didn't quite know what to do with a sentence that was both confession and commitment. Amara's face held still, then softened. She did not indulge in the old wound. She looked at the new path. The twins stood very straight and did not drop their crowns. Zoe stepped forward a half step, the kind of move that changes a life more than the length of a shoe. "Okay," she said, the small word strong. Zara nodded, eyes bright. "Okay." Something in Richard's posture released, an old brace removed. He didn't reach for them. The room wasn't for that. He let the words settle into the carpet, the table, the papers, the brass nameplates, the air that had never carried this kind of truth before. The chair cleared his throat, tried to steer the moment back toward procedure, asked about timelines and interim structures. Richard answered cleanly. He named a senior executive with courage enough to fight for the new commitments and stubbornness enough to carry them through a quarter's worth of objections. He laid out a process that didn't let the promises float free of the balance sheet. He finished not with a flourish, but with the same low tone he used with the twins when he promised the second row. "We will do less of what earned us applause and more of what people can live with." Afterward, the room broke into its necessary fragments: lawyers murmuring, finance huddling, communication sketching sentences meant to land carefully. A few people approached him and offered hands, some stiff with calculation, some warm with a relief they didn't show often. Richard turned toward the glass. Amara met him halfway. The twins anchored the space between them like a bridge that didn't look like one until you tried to cross. "That was a lot," Amara said, eyes searching his for the corners where the old version might still hide. "It was overdue," he said. "You said it in the hardest room," she answered. "I needed to hear it there," he said. The girls tugged at his sleeve with a practical request. "We're hungry," Zara announced, as if reminding the adults that the body keeps its own time. "Good," he said, with a small smile. "Let's fix the easy problem first." They entered. Conversations fell into a hush that had the texture of surprise. Some faces registered calculation, others curiosity. A few softened when they saw the children. Richard didn't stand at the head of the table. He moved to the side, a half step away from the center. Thomas joined the back wall, hands folded, present like a quiet affirmation. Amara stood with the twins near the glass, sunlight laying a stripe across their shoes. "We can pick up where we left off," the chair began, voice smooth. "We won't," Richard said, and the room turned toward him fully. "Not yet." He spoke without notes. The words had lived in him long enough to know their own way out. He acknowledged the questions that had gathered since the night before, named the concerns without varnish, and refused the urge to dress anything in language that let it pass unnoticed. "My father taught me that speed and certainty win," he said. He built practices that protected the return and ignored the people who made that return possible. I learned those lessons well. Too well. A murmur moved across the table, a wind through tall grass. He opened the envelope, slid its contents out smoothly, and didn't look away as he set them down. "This is part of our inheritance," he continued. Through companies meant to keep his name clear, he profited when people were pushed from their homes. We built on that cleared ground. We told ourselves the city was cleaner for it. We told ourselves we were building opportunity. We did not stand still long enough to hear who we were stepping over. The General Counsel took a breath to interject. He held up a hand, not to silence, but to finish the one thought he'd come to say. "I can't ask a team to change if the name on the door won't," he said. "So I'll say this without bargaining or spin. I'm stepping down as CEO today. I'll stay on only long enough to do 3 things I should have done years ago: halt any project that displaces residents without a real path back, create an independent fund to repair and preserve homes we've endangered, and open our books on the developments at the heart of these allegations. When I leave, these commitments leave with me as obligations, not favors." Faces shifted. Some relief. Some alarm. One director leaned toward another, whispering behind a hand. A third stared at the papers as if seeing his own reflection in them for the first time. He looked to the glass wall where Amara stood with the twins, both girls holding their crowns steady with one hand as if they understood the symbolism without the word. He drew a breath that seemed to come from deeper than his lungs. "I also owe you a truth that won't fit in a ledger," he said, turning back to the room but speaking toward the glass. "Years ago, I walked away from someone who deserved better. She built a life without me. By a series of mercies I didn't earn, a storm put me on her porch 2 nights ago. I met 2 girls who knew more about courage than most people I've met in rooms like this." He didn't look for permission from anyone. He turned to the twins. "Zoe. Zara," he said, his voice softer but steady. "You don't need my name to be whole. But I would be honored if you let me say publicly what I should have been present to say from the beginning. I am your father. I didn't know. Now I do. And I will show up." A silence like the inside of a bell followed, shocked and clean. No cameras had been invited, but word traveled without lenses. The room didn't quite know what to do with a sentence that was both confession and commitment. Amara's face held still, then softened. She did not indulge in the old wound. She looked at the new path. The twins stood very straight and did not drop their crowns. Zoe stepped forward a half step, the kind of move that changes a life more than the length of a shoe. "Okay," she said, the small word strong. Zara nodded, eyes bright. "Okay." Something in Richard's posture released, an old brace removed. He didn't reach for them. The room wasn't for that. He let the words settle into the carpet, the table, the papers, the brass nameplates, the air that had never carried this kind of truth before. The chair cleared his throat, tried to steer the moment back toward procedure, asked about timelines and interim structures. Richard answered cleanly. He named a senior executive with courage enough to fight for the new commitments and stubbornness enough to carry them through a quarter's worth of objections. He laid out a process that didn't let the promises float free of the balance sheet. He finished not with a flourish, but with the same low tone he used with the twins when he promised the second row. We will do less of what earned us applause and more of what people can live with. Afterward, the room broke into its necessary fragments, lawyers murmuring, finance huddling, communication sketching sentences meant to land carefully. A few people approached him and offered hands, some stiff with calculation, some warm with a relief they didn't show often. Richard turned toward the glass. Amara met him halfway. The twins anchored the space between them like a bridge that didn't look like one until you tried to cross. That was a lot, Amara said, eyes searching his for the corners where the old version might still hide. It was overdue, he said. You said it in the hardest room, she answered. I needed to hear it there, he said. The girls tugged at his sleeve with a practical request. We're hungry, Zara announced, as if reminding the adults that the body keeps its own time. Good, he said, with a small smile. Let's fix the easy problem first. They left the boardroom together. In the hallway, staff looked up from screens, then looked again. Some smiled, quick and surprised. One woman wiped at an eye and shook her head at herself, then returned to her keyboard. The elevator doors opened like any other day. The city waited, washed and ordinary and ready to be walked through. He didn't look back at the table where his nameplates sat. He had more important places to be when the next storm arrived. The next leak appeared. The next small event asked a grown man to move a bowl 2 inches to the left and pay attention. Work crews arrived early, their ladders tapping a brisk rhythm against the yellow house. Plastic came down. Fans quieted. The ruined section of ceiling was cut back cleanly, replaced, sanded, painted to a matte calm. Outside, shingles found their places with the relief of pieces that had been waiting to fit. The landlord came by with a clipboard and a new tone. A city inspector arrived an hour later, uninvited but welcome. Paperwork followed in a neat stack with dates that meant the work was now a promise, not a favor. Across the city, statements went out under letterhead that used to feel heavier. The firm named an interim leader whose first memo was brief and pointed. Active projects paused pending resident plans. A repair and preserve fund seeded from executive bonuses and a percentage of development profits. Books open to an independent review with deadlines that could be measured in weeks, not seasons. A press conference carried fewer adjectives than usual. The important parts were nouns and verbs. Richard turned in a keycard that no longer opened the private elevator. His office emptied as easily as a jacket pocket. A few photos from ribbon cuttings, a legal pad with a half-drawn site plan, a brass nameplate left on the desk like a shed skin. He carried out a box that didn't look heavy and set it in the trunk of a car that now had crumbs in the back seat from yesterday's school snack. At the yellow house, the twins watched a painter roll careful strokes across the new ceiling. They approved the color and moved on to more pressing tasks, cutting a cardboard crown into cleaner points, gluing a leaf back where it had escaped. Amara read the contractor's invoice twice and nodded at the number like someone who knows the cost of being careful. Richard fixed the socket that sparked by the kitchen window under the electrician's eye, paying attention to instructions and pausing when told. He replaced weather stripping on the back door, then stood aside so Zoe could test the seal with a hand on each side and pronounce it good. Zara supervised a small planting in the front strip of soil, a sapling staked true, a circle of mulch neat around it. She named it for shade they hadn't had before. When the twins asked about the next weekend, the schedule answered with shared squares and penciled arrows instead of stone. Mornings took on a new shape, drop-offs that included 2 seats buckled in the back and a stoplight where jokes about smoothies became routine. Afternoons sometimes found him in a schoolyard, tie loosened, talking to another parent about the peculiar courage of spelling bees. Paperwork moved in the background, forms filed, names added where they belonged, questions answered with patience even when the questions felt like small tests. Amara kept her pace, 2 jobs for now, a plan to sit for the next certification exam, a habit of writing goals on a single index card kept by the stove. She didn't hand over the hard parts of her life. She made room at the table for help that showed up on time and didn't ask to be thanked twice. Thomas brought by a toolbox and a stack of used paperbacks for the girls. The driver arrived walking without a limp, returning a dish he hadn't realized he'd borrowed from the hotel, then stayed to show Zoe how to tie a sturdier knot on the swing. In the neighborhoods mapped too cleanly on slides, meetings hall by hall changed temperature. Residents spoke without microphones because the room learned to quiet itself. Company people sat and took notes by hand. Plans shifted, a parking lot that would become a clinic, a delay that would allow leases to align with lives, a grant for roofs that had been asked to hold too long. On a Thursday afternoon that no one had needed to calendar, the twins came home with paper stars stamped across a math worksheet and a note about a library fundraiser. Richard stood at the counter with a cutting board and a tomato, watching sunlight find the fresh paint and claim it. Amara walked in behind them and placed a folded letter on the table, exam date set, study schedule circled, a small step toward a bigger license. They ate at the small table with the fixed leg. Conversation ran in the simple lines of a day done well. When night came, the house didn't brace, it settled. The new ceiling held. The bucket sat empty on the back porch, clean and stacked, their work put away. Later, after the twins' door clicked into its near-closed position and the streetlight found a steady glow, he stood on the porch beside the sapling. The city smelled like wet soil and asphalt cooling. He could hear a television 2 houses down, a dog calling to another dog across the block, a bus exhaling at the corner. Inside, a phone on the counter lit with a message from a number he still knew by heart from boardrooms. It asked if he missed the work. He watched the screen dim on its own. The question felt small. The work in front of him, ordinary and exacting, did not.
Thank you so much for watching this story to the end. I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know if you did. Mr. Lovely Stories is committed to giving you the best and most touching stories that teach valuable life lessons. So stick around. We have another beautiful story showing on the screen for you. Click on it to watch it now. Always remember, we love you.